Excitement here in New Zealand has been ignited for this tournament.
Hearing our fans being behind us is just unforgettable.
World football at the Women's World Cup from the BBC World Service.
We're going all the way, baby.
Find it wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
As we'll hear soon, the nearness gather online, which will no doubt be increasingly common in exploring spiritual questions in our digital age. But for now, Anjali and I are out in nature doing something that she considers as part of her spiritual practice. Why do you forage?
I do it because I think it gives me more of a connection to the land. I think over the last several years, I've been struggling a little bit with feeling disconnected and out of context and not really understanding kind of where I fit in to groups of people or places. And I've sort of learned that by shrinking down and really exploring my relationship to land, I'm able to contextualize myself better. And so foraging really gives me that, because I have to pay attention to the time of year. I have to pay attention to what supporting plants there are and like who's coming up when. So it's really kind of helped me feel more connected.
She also deals with really heavy dilemmas and decisions as part of her job in humanitarian aid, and was telling me about one scenario around the recent civil war in Ethiopia, where her team couldn't provide care for the type of medical issues people were facing.
We had to turn away a lot of people because we didn't have supplies. And so you're sort of faced with being that person who says, here we are coming from a well-resourced country with supplies, but not for the thing you need. And that there's a moral injury that comes along with doing that kind of work.
So, where do you go to try and work through these sorts of complex experiences and the questions they bring up?
Hi everyone, I'm Casper ter Kuile. I'm one of the co-founders of the Nearness, and we're so glad that you're here on this Nearness journey. You see about 30 people on your screen today, and there's more than 200 people participating in this 8-week journey. So
I've been following Casper ter Kuile's work for a while now. He went to divinity school at Harvard, almost became a Unitarian minister, had a very successful podcast looking at Harry Potter as a sacred text, has written a book about ritual, and he's co-authored studies on how millennials gather. You could say community and spirituality are his things. In fact, I've known about Casper's work for a while now because I too am fascinated by community and by how people of my generation are trying to create it, given we're living in a more secular world and also don't have as much access to traditional community, what with people leaving where they grew up and being part of a more globalized world. For as long as I can remember, I've also had a spiritual yearning, but no religion has really called to me, and I've had to try searching in different ways. I went from the birdsong of Outer Queens to the hustle of Union Square in the middle of Manhattan to meet 36-year-old Casper and find out more about the Nearness. Hey, Casper.
Hey, Nas.
How are you?
Well.
How's it going?
Well, besides not getting run over by buses, it's going well so far.
Yeah, let's find somewhere quiet. I feel I don't know, is it usually so hubbubby? It feels especially noisy.
It's also graduation for NYU today, so I think there's a lot of extra out-of-towners who don't know where they're going.
Is that why I'm seeing people wearing lots of purple robes everywhere?
Yes, it's not a Harry Potter showcase.
Okay, so we're going to find a quiet space to chat, get out of all the noise and hubbub.
Do you want a cup of tea?
Yes, that would be really nice. Yeah.
So I co-founded an organization called The Nearness, and The Nearness is a place to explore life's big questions with like-hearted people. And so when someone signs up, we match them with 4 or 5 other people into a small group. And for 8 weeks, that small group meets every week for 90 minutes and has a series of conversations about life's big questions. So in each gathering, when people get together, we have a pretty clear structure that's followed every time. And that just helps kind of set the container, if I can use that word, right? It just sets the table for the conversation, as it were. There's a small meditation that's read out by one of the volunteers to kind of help everyone just take a couple of deep breaths, get settled, get ready. And then we light a candle as the community covenant is read aloud. And that's really just a series of kind of promises that we make each other about this is how we want to show up during this time. And then there'll be the main conversation. And then at the end, again, there's some closing words with just a couple of deep breaths to kind of help mark the end of the time together. And so really, those kind of ritual elements are there to help set this time aside from our usual life, from our usual conversations. Oh, I just got to check this text message. Oh, I've got to run out to get some milk. You know, this is really set aside to be present, to be together.
Why are these rituals important?
Rituals are really great threshold tools. So they help us move from one way of being into another.
So in front of us, we've got a very nice candle.
Yeah.
We've got a massive box of matches.
I know my small one ran out, so I had to bring the big one. Shall I light the candle?
Yeah.
All right. So everyone lights their candle at the same time. So even though you're on Zoom together, you've got this lovely kind of physical connection. You can see everyone's flame and the smoke rising as it is now. And so even from a distance, you feel connected.
I love the smell of matches.
Isn't it so good?
It's such a nice smell here, yeah.
But that's important, honestly, because the sound of the match strike, the visual of the flame, and then the smell, right? It all helps you know, okay, something is changing.
So far, the Nearness have just completed their 3rd journey. That's the name for the 8 weeks Casper described. Each week, the groups meet for an hour and a half, and there are about 6 people in each group. Every week, a different person leads the session, and the Nearness email a guide before the session with questions and activities to help them explore a theme. For example, recently the groups were looking at the theme of letting go, and the stories we tell ourselves about this, and so were sent a fable to read in the session, along with questions about being passive versus letting go, the moral implications of this, as well as what feelings this brings up for everyone. Many of the participants come back, and Anjali, who we heard from at the start of this program, has been in all 3 of the journeys. People pay to join the journeys, which work out to around $20 per session, and the Nearness also offers scholarships to people who need them. They say they don't make money out of the Nearness, and that these payments cover the cost of running the sessions and the organization. You can just hear Casper's warmth and enthusiasm, and in person he wears a huge smile, has thick, glossy hair, and is always dressed smartly. I wanted to find out about Casper's backstory and what's led his interest in creating spiritual spaces. Now, just to be clear, the Nearness is open to all people, and they have participants from a wide age range, so it's not just about people under 40. And we see this interest in exploring life's big questions across the spectrum today. Whether it's the weekly gatherings of the Sunday Assembly or the teachings of the School of Life. What's led Casper to this point with the Nearness?
So I grew up in England, I grew up in Sussex, but my parents are both Dutch. I grew up without any sort of religious background. And yeah, I'm really interested in this question of where do people find connection and meaning when we don't belong to a traditional religious community. I think a lot of us are realizing that, yes, it's wonderful to have freedoms and choices, but we were also losing some of the vital community connections that help us know who we are and whose we are in a way that, helps our mental health, but also just like the joy of life. And so that's what I'm passionate about.
And so can you tell me a little bit about growing up, kind of where you grew up and what was community for you then?
Yeah, it's one of those things that I didn't realize how unusual my childhood was until I was older. So I'm from a big family. I have 3 younger sisters, and my mother especially was very, very involved in the village that I grew up in. So it's about 5,000 people in the village, but I think all of them walk through our front door at some point. So my mum organized a bike safety campaign and an arts festival, and was a bereavement counselor and a lollipop lady, and helped organize the school fair, and just did all sorts of things, always making friends, building relationships in the village. And as a teenager, I hated it. We also ran a bed and breakfast in our home. So the back door was always open. There was always someone inside. And I was frustrated by that as a kid because I just wanted space and, my own little world. And now that I'm older, I realize what a gift that was, because it just meant that there was nearly always someone over for dinner, that we were embedded in people's lives. We had people come stay with us if they needed a place. Like there was just a constant stream of connection. And it's meant that, my understanding of what a good life is a life of connection. And not just with other people, like also, we would mark down the day that the swallows came back to live in the rafters, and May Day meant getting up early before dawn and going out on the heath and watching the Morris dancers welcome in springtime. And so there was a sense of the kind of rituals and the seasons growing up near the forest. And so I think that sense of belonging was both relational with people, but also about nature and about ritual.
It's interesting because you're describing quite kind of strong community ties and sense of belonging. Was there a time when you felt you didn't belong?
Absolutely. You've hit the nail on the head. So for some strange reason, I chose to leave that life when I was 10. I ended up going to this quite posh prep school. And, at that age, you're starting to figure out your own sexuality and identity. And I knew that I was different. And I didn't fit in. I ended up going to boarding school even for 2 years after prep school, and just had that sense of being completely alone in school. I always knew family was kind of safe. So I came out when I was 15, 16, and that's when things got better again. But that 5-year period, I think it always stays with you. I'm always trying to be conscious of who doesn't feel like they belong, because it's the worst feeling in the world.
You've talked about times in your life when you felt like you hadn't belonged and stuff. Did you turn to religion or kind of dabble or try and seek some of those answers there?
I went to Glamour magazine. I did not go. No, I should answer that seriously. I never really went to look for religion to feel belonging, honestly, because I always felt like, I wouldn't be wanted there, certainly as a younger person. But what I did experience was some friends who introduced me to specific practices. So I had a wonderful mentor who said, why don't you try this meditation? I think you'd really enjoy it. And I did. And so rather than through the kind of communities or theologies, the way in for me was partly through practices. And I think that's something that I've really tried to include in my work as well, is that if we can let go of the labels and the assumptions of what it means to be spiritual, what it means to be religious, why don't we just eat together or be silent together or sing together? Those are the experiences from which we then get to make meaning and be like, I guess talking about this book together was spiritual because we were talking about things of ultimate meaning.
This is the documentary from the BBC World Service. I'm Nasran Tavakoli-Far, and for this episode of Heart and Soul, I'm in New York with Casper ter Kuile, the co-founder of the Nearness, an organization who help people through big life questions and spirituality via weekly sessions online. Casper went to divinity school and began the process to be ordained as a Unitarian minister. For people of my generation, these things seem like stuff people did in the past. So what led Casper down this path?
I ended up becoming a climate activist, and I noticed that, first of all, the leaders that I most respected nearly always had something spiritual going on. And I was distrustful of it, because to me, spirituality meant, institutional clerical abuse. Like that, those two things felt like completely connected. And yet later, I also started to think more and more about, we're not just trying to limit the impacts of climate change. We're also trying to adapt to the impacts that are already here and that are definitely coming. And so then you're starting to ask questions like, well, how do we build a culture of welcome when we're going to get even more climate refugees? Or how are we going to figure out how to change culture around not using as many resources? And so those culture change questions got me really interested in thinking about how have other cultures changed? And that's a question that religion is constantly asking, right? How do we create a moral society? And who gets to decide what's good and moral? I ended up doing a public policy degree in America, and then walking across campus just kept meeting these much more interesting people who were at the divinity school. But, as a gay atheist, I really didn't understand why someone like me would fit in there, but ended up just discovering that all the things I was passionate about, those were the conversations that were happening there. And so I decided to go.
A lot of your work is about how people gather, especially millennials. What were you seeing that got you interested in this?
Well, as more and more people were less and less traditionally religious, you see those stories of decline all the time. The thing I was interested with my colleague was, where are people going instead? Because we still have these innate human longings of being together. And so Angie Thurston and I started to interview kind of secular millennials and just asking them, where do you go? And they told us stories that surprised us. They told us about fitness communities, about maker spaces and justice movements, and very ostensibly secular communities. But when you found out what was happening there, people making meal trains if someone was sick, or they were going to their fitness instructor to ask about what happens when your mother dies. And so we started to look at, gosh, are we not seeing the decline of religion, but a sort of transformation of religion, and that it's happening in unlikely places?
Back searching for plants and spirituality at Alley Pond Park, we're out here foraging for various fruits and plants and looking at the birds, and even spotting some people. We see a lady who is picking a lot of leaves off in the distance.
I think that's a burdock. And my understanding is that it's the roots that you really want, and that they're very difficult to get to. I don't know what you do with the leaves.
Anjali told me about how growing up, she didn't feel connected to her family's faith. It's something I can personally relate to as well, and for me adds to that feeling of disconnection and of the desire for some new way to search and grapple with existential questions. Anjali has been in all three of the journeys the Ninnis have done so far. I found her so thoughtful and gentle, and also very smart, with a fierce sense for justice and for creating a better world. I asked about her own journey with navigating her parents' faith and the need for a group like the Ninnis.
I'm from a family of immigrants. My parents moved over from India before I was born, and I've been living in New York all my life. When my parents came over, they came over mostly by themselves. And I think in most diasporic communities, it's really a family affair when people come over. They either already have family where they're going, or they know that more will follow, and we didn't really have that. To be fair, we did live in Queens, New York, which was sort of the central location for South Asian immigrants at the time. In my neighborhood, we were very close to the biggest Hindu temple, I think the first Hindu temple in the U.S. We would go occasionally on the weekends to bhajans, which are singing groups, or cultural performances, but we didn't really spend regular time. We weren't there every single week the way most participants are. And then I didn't really have the experience of being taught explicitly what all of that meant.
At university, Anjali found herself surrounded by a lot of South Asian people, and there she explored many different faiths through various student groups, including for Hindus, Jains, and Sikhs. She says that this experience actually made her feel even less belonging than she expected, as most of her peers had grown up in communities with big extended families in ways that she hadn't. She also didn't feel connected to some of the teachings.
In the more religious-oriented clubs, the Hindu Students Association and others, it felt like there was a lot of emphasis on maybe specific ritual or maintaining just this religious identity without connecting it to anything outside of the self and outside of this little circle of people. I didn't see how faith connected to what was happening in the world or how people live their lives out in the world. And that was something that I was interested in. I wanted to understand there is so much suffering in the world. There are so many people who need things that they don't have access to, that we have set up a world that bars them from accessing the things they need. What can we do about that? How am I meant to feel about that? How am I meant to feel about participating in that system? And these were my questions, and I felt like these student groups were not connecting to that.
Even though we might think of religion as being somewhere to turn to for these questions.
Yes, and some of my best friends growing up were Catholic, and the kind who actually go to Mass every single Sunday, and still to this day go to Mass every single Sunday. And their politics are actually quite progressive. What I was always interested in with their experiences was that every week there was somebody who would kind of give them a sermon, and that sermon was in some way connected to the world outside. The fact that there were explicit connections being made and that there were sort of instructions for what you were meant to be doing in the outside world was something that was really interesting to me that I didn't have access to when we went to the temple, for example, and you would do a puja, which is like a religious practice of offering sweets perhaps to be blessed or other things to God. But you would do them for things like a new house. And I didn't see the way that was relating to the fact that you have a whole group of people called untouchable. Like, what's happening there? What instructions am I being given for how to treat these people? And do I agree with that or disagree with that? Of course, now I spend a lot of time thinking about caste as a person who, as uncomfortable as I feel owning that identity because I don't feel connected to it, I am from a Brahmin family, which is a high caste family. And even if I don't feel connected to it, I know that it has given me opportunities, even in this country, that I am not even aware of because of the way casteism has been imported into diasporic communities.
Anjali's beliefs around justice led her to becoming a doctor and to now doing humanitarian aid work. But in some ways, this sort of work can also be isolating. She told me about projects she worked on in Bangladesh and Ethiopia, and that she'd have to make decisions about people's lives without having enough resources. This made her feel angry, not just at her work, but at injustice in the world, and yet coming back home to New York wasn't much relief.
I was sort of experiencing a world that was so outside what anybody in my life had experienced or knew in any kind of intimate way. And I think it left me with a lot of anger and bitterness and resentment, and I didn't know what to do with those feelings. And I could tell that I was reaching a place where it was soon to be untenable. That I needed to sort of figure out, okay, how can I go about this business of living in this world that I have seen the absolute worst of and do it for another 40 years? That was kind of the question that I was ruminating over when I found the nearness.
You talked about your work and having these really big questions. Can you give some examples of questions you've had in the guides for the nearness that might have addressed some of these kind of really big dilemmas you've been grappling with?
One thing that has been the most interesting to me has been learning about what questions I'm not interested in. Our second journey in the nearness was about the divine. And given the work that I do and the questions that I have about how we can structure a world that allows people to live in such violence, I think questions about God and the divine seem rational in a way. And I got to that journey, got to those questions, and realized, oh, I don't actually have any interest in this. This is not a question that I have. I don't feel any resonance when I think about the metaphysical. And that was really helpful to me because then I could focus in on this world and some of the more concrete relationships and structures that we have put in place, and just sort of put all of that aside.
Can you describe what the nearness has meant for you and the impact it's had on your own life?
The nearness for me has been a space to explore some of these questions that I have about how to be a person in the world with a group of people who are interested in having that conversation, which isn't something that I necessarily have access to among the rest of my community. And what it has done is help me feel just more secure in my own sort of personal philosophy. It has given me strategies for how to connect with other people. It has taught me that my foraging, my nature walks, are spiritual sacred practices beyond going to, a church or a temple and doing a puja. And it has taught me that focusing down on these small relationships that I have with that mulberry tree or this specific park is spiritual as well.
This episode of Heart and Soul was produced and presented by me. I'm Nastran Tavakolifa. The editor for BBC Audio North in Salford was Helen Grady. You can hear more episodes like this by searching Heart and Soul on the BBC website. The documentary strand is also available to download from wherever you get your podcasts.